It started as something small, something harmless, or at least I told myself it was. Every evening, right after we finished dinner, she would push her chair back with a soft scrape against the floor, gather her scarf from the hook by the door, and step outside. She always said the same phrase, like it had been rehearsed long before I ever heard it: she needed a bit of air. There was never any urgency in her voice, no irritation or tension. Just that calm, almost gentle tone. She would wrap the scarf loosely around her neck, check her phone with a quick, practiced flick of her thumb, and then leave the house with the kind of quiet that made it hard to read her mood. 10 minutes. Sometimes 15. Then she would come back, brush her hands together as if shaking off lingering cold, and tell me the air was good tonight. At first, I didn't think anything of it. People need space. People need a moment alone after long days. Maybe she was decompressing. Maybe the house felt too warm. Maybe she liked the night breeze. There were 100 explanations that made perfect sense, and I accepted all of them without question. But there was something else, too, something I didn't recognize at the time. Each night, after she returned, her expression carried a quiet stillness that didn't match the woman I'd married. Calm on the surface, yes, but hollow beneath, as if she'd left a piece of herself somewhere out there on the street. Her eyes looked both softer and more distant, and there was a faint redness around them that she always blamed on the cold. I convinced myself these were small things, details that didn't matter. I didn't follow her. I didn't ask questions. I didn't look at the clock and count the minutes she was gone. Not yet. Instead, I simply watched the way she exhaled when she came back inside, long and slow, as though she'd been holding her breath the entire time. And though I tried to ignore it, something inside me tugged, a small, uneasy thread winding its way tighter around my ribs, waiting for the moment I could no longer pretend it wasn't there. Her routine settled into our evenings like a quiet tide, predictable, steady, unremarkable on the surface. But the longer it continued, the more I found myself listening for the soft rustle of her scarf, the faint click of the lock, the muted echo of her footsteps fading down the walkway. Each sound pressed itself into my awareness until I couldn't pretend it was ordinary anymore. It wasn't the timing alone that unsettled me, though she always left within minutes of setting down her fork, as if the moment dinner ended, something outside began calling her. It wasn't the cold, either, though the nights were growing sharper, and she never took gloves. Instead, what bothered me most was the expression she carried when she returned. That look of someone who had been cracked open, then carefully stitched back together just enough to walk through the door. She smiled, but it never reached her eyes. Her posture was relaxed, but her shoulders sat slightly uneven, as if she'd been holding herself too tightly for too long. And every night, she touched the same spot on her scarf before hanging it up, gently, almost protectively, the way one might touch a bruise. I tried to dismiss it. I tried to be rational. People have private moments, private thoughts. Not everything was a secret. Not everything was a threat. Yet I found myself paying attention to the smallest details. How she checked her phone more frequently now, always turning the screen slightly away. How she seemed lighter when she walked toward the door, heavier when she returned. How her breath shook just a little, as though she'd been speaking, crying, or both. One night, as she reached for her scarf, her phone buzzed. She froze for the tiniest second before silencing it without looking at the screen. Not nervously, just with intention. Then she turned to me with a practiced softness, asking if I wanted more tea. The pause was brief, barely a heartbeat, but it struck something deep in me. A place where trust and fear lived uncomfortably close together. Later, when she stepped outside again, I caught myself drifting toward the window almost without thinking, drawn by some quiet force I didn't want to name. I didn't look out, not yet. I just stood there, listening to the darkness swallow her footsteps. It was the first time I admitted to myself that something was wrong. Not loud, not obvious, but wrong in a way that settles like dust over a home, unnoticed until it coats everything you touch. And still, I said nothing. Still, I pretended. Still, I waited for the moment when the truth would finally demand to be seen. It happened almost by accident the first time. I wasn't trying to spy. I wasn't even trying to follow her. I simply walked past the living room window at the exact moment she stepped beneath the street lamp across from our house, and my eyes caught on her silhouette as if drawn by a magnetic pull I didn't understand. She stood there with her back slightly hunched, the glow of the lamp tracing a pale halo around her. Her breath rose in small white clouds, dissolving into the night air. And then her hand moved, slow, hesitant, lifting her phone to her ear. I should have stepped away. I should have looked anywhere else. But something in the way she held herself froze me in place. She wasn't relaxed, or bored, or simply passing the time. She looked almost fragile. Her shoulders were trembling, just a little, the way someone trembles when they're holding in words that hurt to speak. Even from inside the house, with the glass between us, I could see the tension in the line of her posture. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to a voice she already knew by heart. And then I saw it, the way her other hand lifted to her mouth, covering it, her fingers trembling against her lips. Her body language was unmistakable tenderness mixed with sorrow, something intimate but painful. She wasn't just talking. She was unraveling. I stepped closer to the window, my breath fogging the glass. The street lamp lit her face just enough to catch the shine in her eyes, tears she wiped away with hurried, practiced movements. She checked her surroundings once, twice, as though the night itself might judge her. When she finally lowered the phone, she stayed there for a moment, unmoving, letting the silence settle around her like a blanket. Her shoulders rose and fell with one deep, shaky breath before she turned and made her way back toward the house, wiping the last traces of emotion from her face. By the time she opened the door, her expression had returned to that strange calm she always wore, gentle, composed, familiar. She smiled as if nothing had happened, as if the night hadn't just peeled back a layer of her I'd never seen before. I stayed by the window long after she walked past me into the kitchen. Because now I knew one thing for certain. Whatever she was doing out there on the street every night, it wasn't just getting air. After seeing her under the street lamp, the quiet in our home began to take on a different shape. It wasn't simply the comfort of two people moving through familiar routines anymore. It felt layered, every silence carrying a weight I couldn't quite name, every small action echoing with something hidden just beneath it. She moved through the evenings with a gentleness that seemed practiced, almost protective. When she washed dishes, her movements were slower than usual, as though each plate were fragile and she feared the sound of anything breaking. When she folded laundry, she lingered on each piece, smoothing the fabric more times than necessary, as if grounding herself with the repetition. But the most unsettling detail was her humming. She had always hummed while she cooked or cleaned, soft, tuneless little melodies that drifted through the house like sunlight. But now the humming was different. The notes were lower, sadder, almost trembling. Sometimes it was barely audible, a whisper of sound she seemed unaware of producing. Other times, it cut off abruptly, replaced by a tense silence, as though she realized she'd allowed too much of herself to slip out. I found myself watching her more closely. Not out of suspicion, more out of concern, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answers concern could lead me to. The lines around her eyes looked deeper, the shadows under them darker. She laughed less often, and when she did, it felt like an echo of something she used to be instead of something she truly felt. And then there were the moments she flinched. Small, almost invisible reactions, when her phone buzzed, when the wind rattled the windows, when I touched her shoulder unexpectedly. Each flinch was tiny, over before it fully happened, but once I noticed one, I saw them everywhere. They painted a picture of a woman carrying something too heavy for her hands, too sharp to hold without bleeding. One evening, after she returned from her nightly ritual, I walked into the bathroom after she'd showered and found the mirror fogged with condensation. On the counter, a towel lay crumpled next to a small puddle of water from her hair, I thought. But then I saw the faint streaks on the mirror, uneven lines wiped with shaky fingers. As if she'd tried to clear her reflection, only to blur it further. It was a moment so small, so easy to overlook, yet it struck me deeper than anything else so far. She wasn't just hiding something. She was hurting under the weight of it. Breaking quietly, piece by piece. And still, every night, she wrapped her scarf, checked her phone, and stepped back into the cold, returning only when whatever was out there had taken its toll on her again. I knew then that the truth wasn't going to reveal itself gently. It was going to tear through the seams of our life the moment I got close enough to touch it. It happened on a night colder than the ones before, when the wind scraped against the windows and carried a sharpness that settled in the bones. She finished dinner quietly, barely touching her food, and excused herself with that same soft phrase, needing a bit of air. By now the words barely registered as language, they had become a kind of ritual chant, something automatic, something she no longer thought about. But I did. I waited only a few seconds after the door clicked shut before moving toward the window. This time, I didn't pretend I was walking by. I stood there, hidden in the dimness of our living room, and let the night reveal what it wanted to reveal. She was under the street lamp again, bathed in its pale glow. The wind tugged at her scarf, lifting it like a thin curtain as she pressed her phone to her ear. Her posture was different tonight, more rigid, as if bracing herself for something she already knew would hurt. And then I heard it. Faint, muffled by distance and glass, but unmistakably hers, the sound of her voice breaking in half. Not words, not clear ones, but a kind of trembling softness I'd only heard from her twice in our entire marriage. Once when her mother died. Once when we almost separated. Now it was directed into a phone, towards someone else. She lifted her free hand to her forehead, fingers curling into her hair as if trying to hold her thoughts together. A single breath, sharp and unsteady, escaped her lips. Her body shook with it. And though I still couldn't hear the words, the tone told me more than the content ever could. This wasn't anger. It wasn't flirting. It wasn't simple sadness. It was grief. Deep, swallowed, long-festering grief. She spoke again, softer this time, her head bowed. The lamp behind her stretched her shadow across the pavement, long and fragile. Every few seconds she paused, as if waiting for a response. But her posture, the tilt of her head, the absence of tension in her shoulders, told me no one was speaking back. She was pouring her heart into silence. I leaned closer to the glass, barely breathing, and for the first time, I noticed something I had missed before. The gentleness in her expression wasn't for the person she was talking to. It was for the memory of the person she wished could answer. A past she hadn't buried. A wound she'd never allowed to scar. A ghost she was still trying to make peace with. That realization struck harder than any confession could have. It meant her pain wasn't new, it had been living quietly inside her for years, unspoken and unresolved. And somehow, without ever asking for it, I had become part of its weight. That night, I didn't confront her. Didn't step outside. Didn't breathe her name into the darkness. I simply stood there, watching the woman I loved speak to someone I could not see, someone she had lost long before she ever walked back inside to me. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It came in fragments, slipping through cracks she didn't notice she'd left open. After the night when her voice trembled under the street lamp, I found myself listening more carefully, not with accusation, but with an ache that felt both protective and terrified. And then, a few evenings later, it happened. Not a full word. Just a sound. A soft exhale shaped into a name. I wasn't even at the window this time. I was walking down the hallway, passing our slightly open front door, when her voice drifted inside, carried by cold air, tinged with a tenderness that didn't belong to me. It was barely louder than a breath, but it stopped me instantly. A name. Familiar and unfamiliar at once. Spoken with a quiet longing she had never used with me. I stood still, feeling the floor tilt beneath my feet. The name itself didn't matter, I understood that immediately. What mattered was how she said it, as if it were a wound she kept pressing just to feel something real. Her voice softened again, carrying a tone soaked in regret. Not desire. Not excitement. Regret. It was the kind of tone a person uses when speaking to someone they wronged, someone they never stopped apologizing to, even years later. When she returned inside, she wiped her cheeks quickly, like she always did, but this time she paused at the doorframe. Her hand pressed against it for balance, her breath catching in a way she hoped I wouldn't hear. She looked smaller somehow, as if every step back into our house cost her a piece of strength she no longer had. She moved around the kitchen quietly, carefully, almost like she was afraid that anything too loud might shatter her. I watched the way she avoided looking at her reflection in the microwave door, the way her fingers trembled when she poured herself water, the way she kept touching her phone as if checking for a message she knew wouldn't come. It was then that I realized this wasn't a secret she was proud of. It wasn't something she was hiding from me because she wanted to protect the lie. She was hiding it because it was breaking her. Whatever that name meant, whatever history it carried, it was the center of a guilt she had been living with long before I ever noticed her slipping outside at night. It was a guilt she had never spoken aloud, not to me, not to anyone. And though I didn't know the full story yet, didn't know how deep the roots ran, I knew this much. She wasn't calling someone she hoped to build a future with. She was calling someone she had ruined a past with. Someone she still grieved. Someone she still owed something to. Someone she could not let go of, even if they were already gone. The name lingered in my mind long after she fell asleep that night, hovering like a question I wasn't ready to ask, a truth I wasn't prepared to hear. The truth didn't come from her lips. It surfaced in the stillness of a morning when she left her phone on the kitchen counter, something she almost never did anymore. She was in the shower, the water running loud enough to mask the quiet buzz of a notification that lit up the screen. I hadn't intended to look. I had spent weeks resisting the urge. But something inside me, worry, fear, mercy, I'm still not sure, pulled my eyes toward it. It wasn't a new message. It was a thread already open. A conversation she had returned to again and again, long after the person on the other side had stopped responding. The first thing I noticed was the name at the top. The same name she whispered at night. My chest tightened. My breath stalled. But what I discovered next wasn't what I'd prepared myself for. There were no flirtations. No plans. No suggestive photos. No betrayal of that kind. Just messages full of apologies. Long ones, short ones, fragments typed late at night, confessions squeezed between breaths. Some were written in frustration, others in grief, but all of them carried the same refrain, guilt she had never spoken aloud. Messages like, I should have told him years ago. I'm sorry. She never deserved to grow up with this confusion. I don't know how to fix any of it. I'm trying to do the right thing, I promise. Pages of remorse sent to someone who had not replied in months, and then longer. And then the detail that hollowed me out completely. The last message before her apologies began wasn't from her. It was an automated text. A memorial announcement. Sent to contacts who had once been close. He had died nearly 2 years ago. She was texting a ghost. Her guilt wasn't about rekindling anything. It wasn't about desire. It wasn't about choosing someone else over me. It was about a mistake that had shaped her life long before she returned to our home each night holding her breath. A mistake that left a child in the world, a child she had never told me about, a child she had quietly watched from a distance, a child she spoke to every night as though trying to stitch herself into a life she had abandoned. And now, seeing her messages, it was painfully clear. She wasn't trying to resurrect a past love. She was trying to ask forgiveness from the only person who could never grant it. I set the phone down with hands that didn't feel like mine. Because love can survive many wounds, lies, distance, secrets, but watching someone mourn the life they shared with someone else. That kind of grief pulls a marriage apart without ever raising its voice. Knowing the truth didn't make anything easier. If anything, it deepened the distance between us in ways I couldn't articulate. The house felt different now, filled with shadows that hadn't been there before, holding echoes of a story I was never meant to hear. She moved through her days with a careful stillness, completely unaware that I knew. Her smiles were softer, but thinner. Her silences longer. She seemed exhausted in a way that sleep couldn't fix, as if every breath she took was measured against the weight pressing on her chest. And I found myself shrinking away from her without meaning to. Not out of anger. Not out of betrayal. But out of something quieter, heavier, the realization that she was living 2 lives at once, the one beside me, and the one she buried inside herself, shaped by guilt and a child I had never been allowed to know existed. At night, when she thought I was asleep, she curled into herself, holding her phone to her chest like a fragile relic. Her breathing trembled, sometimes catching in a way that told me tears were gathering but not falling. She didn't whisper his name anymore. She didn't whisper anything. It was as if even her dreams had grown tired. The distance between us became physical. A wider gap in the bed. A longer pause before touching my arm. A brief flinch whenever our eyes met for too long. She wasn't pulling away from me. She was collapsing inward. Once, while folding laundry, she froze with one of my shirts in her hands. Her fingers pressed into the fabric as if anchoring herself, and her shoulders began to shake. Not dramatically, not loudly, just a quiet, invisible unraveling that ended as quickly as it began. She folded the shirt neatly afterward, placing it in the pile with trembling care. I watched her from the doorway, unseen, torn between wanting to comfort her and knowing she wasn't grieving anything I could soothe. She was grieving a life she had destroyed, a man she had betrayed, a daughter she had never been brave enough to claim. Her guilt wasn't about me. It wasn't about us. It was older, deeper, and carved into her in ways love could not mend. And yet, in the middle of all of this, she still set my coffee on the counter the way I liked it. She still touched my shoulder when she walked past me, even if her hand hesitated before landing. She still said goodnight with a softness that broke me more than any confession could have. Because love was still there. Buried. Bruised. But there. What wasn't there anymore was the illusion that I fully knew the woman sleeping beside me, or the life she had carried alone for so long. And in that quiet realization, something inside me cracked too. Not loudly. Not suddenly. Just enough for the truth to seep in. We were living together, but grieving separately, bound by a silence neither of us knew how to break. The night everything shifted wasn't dramatic. There were no raised voices, no accusations, no sudden revelations. It was simply the night she came home with her eyes redder than I had ever seen them, her steps unsteady, her breath uneven as she tried to compose herself before walking through the door. She failed, just a little enough for me to see the truth she had been holding back for years. She didn't notice me watching her. She didn't see the way my chest tightened at the sight of her trembling hands. She moved through the hallway like someone carrying something fragile, something painful, something she no longer knew how to hold. For a moment, I thought she might speak. Her lips parted slightly, as if the confession was right there, perched on the edge. But then she swallowed it, the way she always did, burying her truth beneath layers of practiced calm. This time, though, the calm wasn't convincing. It wavered around the edges, unable to hide the tremor in her breath or the heaviness in her steps. She didn't go to bed immediately. Instead, she sat on the edge of the couch, staring down at her hands. Her fingers curled and uncurled, like she was preparing herself for something she couldn't yet give shape to. And in that small, fragile gesture, I finally understood the depth of what she carried. She wasn't trying to protect herself. She was trying to protect me. From the daughter she had never told me about. From the guilt she had nurtured in secret. From the truth that had become too tangled for her to unravel. She had spent years convincing herself that silence was mercy, that if she kept her mistakes separate from our life, she could shield me from the pain of knowing I had built a home with only half the story. But silence had its own cost. I watched her breathe, watched her fight tears she would never let fall in front of me, watched her fold her hands together tightly as though holding on to the last bit of strength she had. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. She wasn't choosing him over me. She wasn't choosing the past over the present. She was drowning in the space between the two. And I wasn't losing her to another man. I was losing her to the memory of the woman she used to be, the one who had made mistakes she didn't know how to forgive herself for. The room felt unbearably quiet. Heavy with everything she couldn't say, everything I already knew, everything neither of us could fix. But in that silence, another truth settled into place. Some wounds don't ask to be healed. They only ask to be understood. And for the first time, I allowed myself to truly see her, not as the wife who stepped outside each night, not as the woman who carried secrets I wasn't meant to hold, but as someone who had spent years living with a ghost she couldn't lay to rest. That understanding didn't make the pain disappear. But it made it honest. And honesty, even the quiet kind, was the first step toward whatever would come next. The final shift wasn't loud. It didn't collapse our life in a single moment. Instead, it arrived the same way everything else had, to softly, quietly, like a truth stepping out from behind a curtain after waiting too long. It happened on a night when the air outside was still, and she didn't reach for her scarf after dinner. She sat with her hands clasped together, eyes lowered, as though gathering the last fragments of strength she had left. There was a heaviness in her posture, but also a strange calm, as if some inner battle had finally exhausted itself. She didn't go outside. She didn't make the call. She simply sat there, breathing slowly, staring at the floor like it might offer her forgiveness. And for the first time in weeks, I didn't wait at the window. I didn't listen for her footsteps. I didn't watch her fold into herself under the street lamp's light. Instead, I stayed in the room with her, letting the silence fill the space between us without trying to escape it. The quiet was different this time. Less heavy. Less sharp. Almost resolved. I knew she hadn't healed. Not fully. Not even close. But something in her had shifted, a small surrender, a recognition that the burden she carried had grown too heavy to hide. Whether she was ready to speak or not didn't matter. What mattered was that she didn't run from it anymore. Later, when she finally went to bed, she didn't curl away from me like before. She lay closer than she had in weeks, her breathing steady, no tremors threading through it. And as I watched her sleep, with the moonlight soft against her features, I realized the truth that had been forming in me all this time. I couldn't fix what she carried. I couldn't rewrite her past, or erase her guilt, or bring peace to a ghost she still loved in some quiet, complicated way. But I could understand. I could see her. Not the version of her shaped by secrets, not the shadow molded by regret, but the woman who never stopped trying, even when she failed herself. Understanding wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it wasn't anger anymore either. It was something quieter. Something closer to acceptance. The beginning of a different kind of grief, the kind that softens instead of sharpens. In the stillness of that night, she finally slept without whispering apologies into the dark. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange, fragile peace settle over the house, not because everything was fixed, but because everything was finally honest. Sometimes love doesn't survive because it stays perfect. Sometimes it survives because it learns to live alongside the ghosts, without pretending they aren't there. And as I watched her breathe softly, no longer haunted by the weight of her silence, I understood. This was the closest we had come to healing.